Andrew Williamson here. Welcome back to Williamson Education. During our last lesson, we dove into what I suggested was the most important part of speech, verbs. Today we're going to discuss a close second for that title of most important part of speech, the noun. Ah yes, the noun. That most humble and most fundamental category of word. How much could there be to say about nouns? They are basically things in speech and writing. Mirror, chair, table, these are all nouns. Cell phone, belt, bottle, these are all nouns. Ideas, thoughts, and feelings, these too are nouns. The list of nouns goes on and on. There is no end to the number of nouns in our language. Nouns are commonly believed to be words that fall into the category of people, places, and things. While this is a good way to begin understanding what nouns are, the reality of the situation is a bit more complex. Most of the nouns that I just mentioned are what are called concrete nouns, meaning that these nouns are physical. You can touch them, hold them. The world of nouns, though, is much larger than just physical objects. It also includes so-called abstract nouns, which are non-object things such as happiness and emotion, swimming, a sport, and adulthood, a stage of life. In order to analyze sentences correctly, it's important to understand that nouns can take these two forms of concrete and abstract. In the Oxford English Dictionary, the word noun has an interesting etymology, an interesting origin story or history. A noun is, in its most basic sense, a name that we give to the physical objects and non-physical things that we find in the world. We tend to think that only humans have names. In reality, all of the things that we discuss in language must be named in order to enter the world of words. Nouns are these names that we use to transport concrete physical objects into the relatively intangible realm of language. Nouns can serve several functions in sentences, but the most important is the one that I have already begun to explain. Nouns serve as the subjects of verbs in sentences. The subject of a sentence, once more, is the thing that performs the action of the verb in the sentence. Now, as you will recall, the subject is one of the two necessary elements that makes a sentence a sentence. In other words, the subject of a verb is a special role performed by a noun. When a noun becomes a subject of a sentence, that noun becomes the most important noun in the sentence. It's a so-called indispensable element of the sentence, meaning that if that noun were removed, the sentence would stop being a sentence. You can see why nouns are so very important. Nouns have a second very important role too that we've yet to mention, and that is closely related to their role as subjects. Nouns can also serve as objects in sentences. What are objects? They are, in many ways, the opposites of subjects. Whereas subjects perform the action of verbs in sentences, objects are defined as the things that receive the action of the verb in those sentences. Every sentence needs to have a subject in order to be considered a sentence, but not every sentence has an object. Objects are less essential than subjects, you might say. Once again, subjects perform the action of the verb in a sentence. Objects receive the action of the verb in a sentence. Let's take a look at a couple of examples in order to understand these two roles a bit better. Consider, for instance, the following sentence. Emily threw the softball. Let's start by identifying the action in the sentence. That would be the action of throwing, captured in the conjugated verb threw. Now that we've identified the action, let's continue our analysis of the sentence. Who or what is doing the action of throwing? That would be the person named in the first word of the sentence, Emily. So Emily is performing the action of the verb, and therefore she is the subject of the verb. Every sentence has a subject, so we know we always need to look for that when we analyze the grammar of the sentence. But what about an object? Does a sentence have an object, a noun that receives the action of the verb? In fact, it does. We may look after the verb threw to see that there is a word that has been affected by the action of Emily's throwing. That word would be softball. We see that the sentence therefore has an object too, softball. The sentence that I've used here as an example is a classic example of sentence structure in English. Generally, in English, the subject of a sentence comes before the main verb. If there is an object in the sentence, that object will generally come after the verb. This sentence structure even has an official name, Subject-Verb-Object, or SVO for short. Let's look at another example just to make sure that we understand how to identify subjects, verbs, and objects. I'll make this second example slightly more complicated. Here it is. Before going to school, my sister tied her shoelaces. I'll say that once more. Before going to school, my sister tied her shoelaces. This sentence is a bit more challenging because I've added a modifying phrase at the beginning of the sentence, before going to school. Where is the main verb in the sentence? It can be a bit difficult to tell because I've added an extra distractor verb in going. But we should ignore opening phrases as we analyze the grammar of the sentence. The main body of the sentence is, my sister tied her shoelaces. Let's analyze this portion of the sentence to locate the main verb, then the subject, and then the object if there is any. What is the main action taking place in this sentence? That would be the action of tying. My sister tied her shoelaces. The conjugated verb tied is the main verb in the sentence. Now we ask ourselves, who or what is performing the action of the tying? We also know very well that subjects typically come right before verbs in sentences. All of this leads to the conclusion that the subject of the verb must be my sister. She comes right before the verb, and she is the one performing the action of tying. Now that we've located the action in the sentence and have identified the person performing the action, we should also ask whether there is any person or thing receiving the action of the verb. And in fact, in this sentence, there is. What is my sister tying? She's tying her shoelaces. As a result, we can conclude that the word shoelaces is the object of the sentence. Once again, we see that the sentence follows the normal order of subject-verb-object, also known as SVO. This means that the sentence is arranged in a standard order. To be clear, not all sentences will follow the standard SVO structure, and sometimes there are good reasons for not following this order. That said, it's generally best to first understand the normal syntax of sentences in English language grammar before attempting to change course from that normal syntax. Syntax, by the way, is what we have been discussing during today's lesson. Syntax is a fancy word for sentence structure in English, and you will hear me using this word often as we go forward through our lessons. As you become more skilled at analyzing the syntax of sentences in English, you may find you understand the rules well enough to begin adapting them. This will mean a solid movement forward in your progress. When it comes to English language grammar, developing control over the rules of syntax is the first step to knowing how and when to break these rules. For instance, you may eventually choose to use what is called a more passive structure in your sentences by placing the object of a sentence before and the subject after the verb in the sentence. We will examine SVO syntax in greater depth in later lessons. But for now, it's enough to know that nouns play an essential part in both of these fundamental roles in the structure of English language sentences. Once you've identified the main verb in a sentence, the next step is always to locate its subject, and then to decide whether any object exists in the sentence too. Following this order of operations will help you grasp the essence of the grammar of just about any sentence you might come across in English. That's everything for today. Spread the word.